Here we go. So a lot of the underlying issues or debates or concepts in psychology are rooted in philosophy. And then once psychology became more and more of a science, a lot more of its practitioners tried to resolve these philosophical issues using the scientific method rather than just sort of logical arguments based in philosophy. So we're just going to sort of talk over what some of those logical arguments were, what some of the assumptions were, and then how the scientific method came to be a part of psychology, and as we'll see, to be a major part of cognitive psychology. So starting out with the concept of the origin of knowledge. So there's this dichotomy of rationalism versus empiricism. So rationalism refers to the idea that knowledge comes to us through our reasoning abilities. So we are able to reason because we inherently can use logic. So in terms of experiences that we have in the world, the experiences that we have gives us information, but it is not until our minds transform that information into knowledge that we actually know it, quote unquote. So for example, it's not enough to just see a flower and say, oh, that flower is red. That's just simply information about the world. Rationalism says that we have to use logic that is sort of inherent. It's innate to being a human. We all can innately use logic. We have to use logic to then go, oh yes, I'm going to transform this sensory information of red into knowledge of knowing what red is. I know that red is a color. I know that red, often appears in these different kinds of settings. I know what red means, right? If I see it on a stop sign or something like that. And so in contrast to this, empiricism is the idea that we don't have to really do anything to obtain knowledge other than just sort of just take it in, just soak it in and record it in our memories. And so as you can see, this also gives us the distinction between rationalism and empiricism in terms of the activity level of the mind. So a rationalist view of the mind sees the mind as really active, really a go-getter, taking the sensory information and putting it through different cognitive processes and arriving with knowledge. Whereas empiricism is like, no, like the mind is just a sponge. It's just soaking up the things around it, holding on to it. And that's what knowledge is. Whatever you soak up, that's knowledge. So what do these mean for us? So since we are scientists, we actually do end up using both rationalism and empiricism. And so in that regard, rationalism allows us to apply the rules of logic when we are investigating something using the scientific method. And empiricism also lets us use direct observation of events in our world. So we're able to put actually both of these together, seemingly oppositional things, to robustly study the world around us. And so there are a couple of assumptions to science that I just want to point out. So the first one is that there are events in our world that are lawful. That means that there are events, they don't just happen randomly for no reason. There's some sort of rule, there's a law that's guiding the sequence of those events or the occurrence of that event. The second assumption is that we as humans, we are able to then identify these laws that guide the events. So events follow laws and we can figure out what those laws are. And then finally, a really crucial goal of science is to be able to identify the cause of something. So it's not just enough to go, oh, I drop a pencil, it falls to the ground. Great. Science says there has to be a law there. There has to be something causing that to happen. And so with science, we can say, ah, yes, there is something causing this to happen. And then we can also go one step further. What is causing this to happen? Why is it happening? And so science essentially says, if we can understand what causes an event, we can then predict it perfectly and accurately. It's just sort of like this formula of like, if this, then this. Great. 100% of the time, always happens. So keeping this in mind, we will, yes, Noah.
Sorry to cut in. Is there
No.
is there a PowerPoint for this?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if we can see that.
Okay.
I think we're still on the or at least I can't see it.
Okay.
Yeah, we're still on the syllabus.
Oh, good.
Sorry,
Okay.
I was just
No, that's okay. No, I'm so glad that you told me. Thank you so much. I'm just like talking about philosophy and you're like, where's that in the syllabus? Okay. Okay, how's this? Hooray! I mean, I'll still be talking abstractly, but at least you'll have a visual. So, all right, great. Yeah, and if you ever have any questions, yeah, just feel free to interrupt me. You can even just like unmute yourself and talk. That's totally fine. I definitely don't want you to feel like, oh, I just have to like remember all my questions at the very end. And also, honestly, I don't remember the things that I say. So you might be like, yeah, 20 minutes ago you said this, and I'll be like, did I? Okay, great. So it just works for both of us. So, okay, so yes, science wants us to not only understand something of, oh, when I drop a pencil, it falls to the ground, but we want to be able to predict that as well. Okay, so we're gonna kind of eventually come back to that concept, but let's talk about another concept that's really important in psychology that's going to have implications for cognitive psychology. So another area that has had a lot of debate come up has been what causes our abilities, what causes humans to develop, what causes us to learn. And one of the most contentious things has been the debate over our biological heritage and also our experiences. So you've heard it called the nature versus nurture debate. It's also, if you want to use more technical jargon, it's the nativist versus empiricist debate. And so throughout the history of philosophy and so much of psychology, both philosophers and psychologists have attempted to really try to state with a lot of confidence whether it's our genes or whether it's the environment that shapes us and our behavior. So going all the way back to the Greeks, it always starts with the Greeks, at least in psychology and philosophy. And so, for instance, Plato believed that the ideas and the knowledge that we have are innate. They're with us at birth, because he argued that our souls are separate from our bodies and that they actually exist within this realm of ideas. So they're surrounded by ideas and knowledge. And then when we're born, our soul is then trapped into our body. So the soul is what has the ideas and the knowledge. And so that's why knowledge is innate. It's with us right at birth because it's what comes from our soul. It's right there. It's part of us. So in direct contrast to that, because these are debates, another classical Greek philosopher, Aristotle, argued against Plato and said, no, all knowledge comes to us through our senses. And this is the only way that we can have knowledge about the world. So we don't come into the world with any preset ideas or sense of knowledge. We gain knowledge as we go through life. And this debate came up yet again in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly with a man named John Locke, and he took Aristotle's side. He presented this idea that people are born tabula rasa, which is Latin for a blank slate. So in his view, experience writes upon the slates experience writes upon us, it gives us different experiences, right? Like we know that even siblings who were raised in the same home had different childhood experiences. And so life writes on our slates, and that's what makes people unique. So it's not that we're born with anything. What we experience in the world is what makes us. And then you had Rousseau, who believed that young children were, as he called them, noble savages. So essentially, he thought that humans are born just pure and innocent, and we are just innately good. And if just left to their own devices, they can develop optimally without any problems. So, you know, if they don't have any sort of trauma or tragedy or life-changing event, like they'll become who they're supposed to be. But if there is interruption, then rather than the noble part, they'll go to the savage part. So again, kind of this idea of, I like to think of it as kind of like there's like a seed, there's like a potential within us, and if it's given all the right conditions, it'll turn into the plant that it's supposed to be. But if not, then it'll be something that very different. So to just introduce even more ideas, even more cooks to the kitchen, there were some folks who took opposite sides of the debate. So like John Watson, if you remember from your intro to psych class, or if you've taken psych of learning, you're like, oh gosh, Watson. You might remember that he really boasted that he could take any number of infants. Just give me any baby, regardless of their background, and I can make them into whatever I want them to be. I can make them into a doctor, I can make them into a lawyer, firefighter, you know, a thief, politician, anything like that. And he used this pretty big claim in order to emphasize his belief that the environment is what is the critical influence in human development and learning. Gazelle instead argued against Watson and was like, no. Development is the result of what he called an unfolding of maturational processes. So it's kind of like this idea that there's this alarm on our like biological clocks. And then when that alarm goes off, then there's a new ability or learning process that begins to unfold. So when the biological clock of about 1 year goes off, that's when you're really starting to acquire language and learn how to speak and understanding speech. When the biological clock of, you know, being 2 years old comes around, that's when you're really learning how to walk and navigate your environment, things like that. So great, we have all of these different ideas, we have all of these different debates of this very hotly contested, well, is it nature or is it nurture? And then in the mid-1900s, psychologists began to realize that they'd really been asking the wrong kinds of questions. So the questions had been along the lines of things like, which factor causes development? Is it nature or is it nurture? And some questions that then came out of that were, well, how much of our genes then influences a particular behavior? Or how much of an environmental factor then influences this certain behavior? And so the problem with these questions, psychologists eventually realize, is that it's really impossible to answer them because we can't separate out our genes from our experiences. They're a lot more intertwined than this sort of dichotomous one or the other idea. So it's impossible to resolve this issue asking these kinds of questions. So psychology came to realize, well, there's actually a better, more interesting, productive question. So it's more about in what manner do nature and nurture interact. And so notice the assumption here. We've gone from thinking that it's either or, it's either nature or nurture, to, well, now it's both and. Now it's both our genes, our biology, and the environment. So any questions about that? I think that's kind of a good place for us to stop for the day, just because I don't want to get too much more in depth in the next section. Does anybody have any remaining questions, either about the class, the very philosophical lecture we just went over?
I have sort of a thinking ahead question.
Yeah, for sure.
How many chapters will be on each exam?
So it's going to be broken up into 5 chapters per exam.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So they will be cumulative in the terms of like whichever chapters have preceded them, but it's not like the final is going to be about all of the chapters that we've covered. The final will just be on the last 5 chapters.
I have kind of a follow-up question to that one as well.
Yeah, for sure.
What would you say, like, how much of the questions are like more book-based versus lecture-based? Do they lean either way, or are they more of a mix?
It'll be more of a mix. I'm gonna try to stick to the book as close as possible without it being like you show up to lecture and you're like, oh my God, I could have just skipped this lecture and just read the book. So yeah, it's going to be a mix, and I'm hoping that with the lectures, it'll add just a little bit more of sort of a more applied sort of understanding. The book is great in its technicality, but I know that it can be a little bit dense. So I'm hoping that our time spent in the lecture can maybe humanize the language a little bit more, and sort of help you make a little bit more sense out of the more clunky jargon that's in the book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking. Any other questions before we end for today?
I was just gonna say I'm waitlisted, so I can just stay after, so we can talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, let's chat. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for showing up, and it's great to see you all and meet you all, and I'm really looking forward to our time together, and really looking forward to how lab goes for you all as well. I hope that is a really enriching part of this course as well, to be able to have the applied side of cognitive psychology in addition to just the theoretical side. So I hope that you all take care and stay safe, and I will see you for lecture on Wednesday.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.